16 of the 6-month countdown, ready to homeschool. You can find the notes on my blog, hilarioushomeschooling.com, so that you can have these printed out and follow along and do some homework if you want to. I'm not going to make you. Today we're going to be talking about the various approaches to homeschooling. They could be called methods, philosophies, approaches, styles, all of these things. When I was first looking at homeschooling, I just assumed that everybody homeschooled the same way. And when I started reading books by homeschoolers, I got so confused because they were all like talking about the way they did homeschool. And I didn't see how in the world I had time in the day to do homeschool the way that everybody else did homeschool, because one person would do, 4 hours at home like this, and another person would do, nature trips for 4 hours in the afternoon. Another person would take their kid on a road trip and take a whole week or two to go see the Rocky Mountains and call it school. And I was like, this is a lot. Like, if everybody homeschools like this, I don't know that I can do it, because it was so overwhelming to think about trying to adopt everybody else's philosophies of homeschooling and make it all work for our family. By the time I've gotten to now in my life, I am realizing that homeschoolers are just as varied as the rest of the population. You can meet two homeschooling families and they can have nothing else in common except for the fact that they both give their kids an education at home. Because of that, you are going to have many, many, many options available to you for how you would like to implement homeschooling in your family. So different people can give you advice and different people can tell you how they do it, but because they don't live in your home and they don't walk in your shoes, they can't tell you how to homeschool. This is why I encourage you to use all of this time to do the 6-month countdown, to get involved and think through what you want to do, because it will make it much easier when you actually start homeschooling to have already adopted a philosophy and a framework for your family. When you rush into homeschooling and to try to adopt what other people have done in your own home, it may be a completely wrong fit, and you may have starts and stops over and over and over and over until you finally stumble into the way that homeschooling works for your family. I'm not saying you won't have starts and stops anyways. Oftentimes families do, because it's also new to them and they're trying something different, and families get interrupted with emergencies in the family and other things that come up. So I don't want to promise you that just because you do your homework, you're going to be able to hit the ground running in August. Sadly, that probably won't happen anyways. But if you do your homework, you'll be much more confident as you make your plans for August, and you will be less likely to get blown off track anytime that an interruption comes up. So that is why we're spending a whole entire session talking about the different approaches to homeschool, so that you can learn some of the ways that other families have homeschooled, and so that you can find a way that meshes with your family. And you may end up adopting several different methods, which is called eclectic. E-C-L-E-C-T-I-C. It's the idea that you've adopted a little bit of this approach, a little bit of this approach, a little bit of this approach, and you melded it together in a way that works for your family. So you can have eclectic styles in furniture, you can have eclectic styles in cooking. Eclectic just means a random mixture. So that can happen in homeschool as well. Just because two families homeschool, it does not mean that they will agree about everything. That is a huge misconception, and it has led to ridiculous stereotypes, which are also funny and hilarious. If you've seen some of the YouTube videos that make fun of homeschooling families, they are pretty funny, because there are a lot of things that people assume are true of homeschoolers, which may or may not be. Yes, we do homeschool in our pajamas if we feel like it. Not often, every once in a while. All right. So let me just get started here. The Bible verse for today comes from Deuteronomy. It's one of the most famous ones that everybody likes to bring out when they're talking about homeschooling their children. It is in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 11:18. Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your children may be many in the land that the Lord swore to give your forefathers, as many as the days that the heavens are above the earth. God is promising the Israelites that if they will consistently teach their children his ways, not just once in a while, not just for a couple minutes on a Sunday, but consistently throughout every day, that they will be teaching the children God's ways, that he will bless them. When we talk about homeschool, we're talking about more than just the Bible. We're talking about academics and knowledge of other subjects as well. But this philosophy seems to be implying that every place that you go can be a real place to teach your kids something about God, about his world, about his ways, about his people. So in that way, it makes it sound like a very informal teaching arrangement. I want to come back to that in a little bit and talk about other ways that Jesus taught. But first, I want to go ahead and go over some of the approaches to homeschooling. And I tried not to name a whole bunch of names because I don't think I can make an exhaustive list. I think there's too many different approaches to homeschool. So what I'm doing instead is I'm giving a list of questions that you can consider when you're looking at a curriculum, or when you're looking at a homeschool approach, or when somebody's trying to tell you how they homeschool. This is a list of questions that can help you uncover somebody's philosophy and somebody's approach to homeschool. On the second page, I did give some names and some ideas of what to Google search and some other resources that you can find, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Okay, so here's some questions that you can ask if you're trying to determine somebody's approach to homeschooling. And don't be judgmental, because any of these ways can work for a certain family, maybe your family. Who is in charge of determining what is learned? That's one of the first things you can ask if you're investigating an approach to homeschool. And you could get several different answers. The three most common answers that I thought of were the curriculum company. Maybe you've hired a video service to teach your kids. And in that case, they would be the ones determining what your child's going to learn. The parent might be the one in charge of determining what the child learns. And that's what we commonly think of with homeschool. But they may be using different curriculum or different worksheets or different books to accomplish their goals. The third answer that can be given is the student. Some parents firmly believe that their students are quite capable of choosing what they want to learn for themselves. This approach to homeschooling is really called unschooling in most circles, because they're saying, we're not going to come up with a curriculum for our child. We're not going to guide their interests. We're going to let the student decide what they want to learn and when they want to learn it. So I come at this from several different point of views. I went to a college to learn about teaching, and so my education degree screams against unschooling and ties in more with, letting experts decide what your child needs to learn. So I would side, well, at least in the very beginning, I would have sided more with a very strict, organized scope and sequence, deciding what needs to be, the child needs to learn when. I would have freaked out about unschooling. But I've lived several years since then, and I have come closer to unschooling than I ever thought that I would. And it's not awful. It's not terrible. The kids don't just sit around doing nothing. They actually do have interests that they didn't realize they had because they were so busy meeting everybody else's expectations. When you free your child up to explore what really truly interests them, they'll surprise you. They'll find things to study that you wouldn't have put on their list, but that doesn't make them less valid. Sometimes they investigate something so thoroughly that you had no idea that amount of learning existed in that topic. So they actually become experts in something that the curriculum never would have asked them to be experts in. Is this wrong? I don't think so. I do think that if you're living in America, there is a certain expectation that an educated child who has gone through schooling will know a list of topics that they would expect a child to understand, Aesop's fables or Pythagorean's theorem or plate tectonics. I mean, there's just certain things in our world that we just assume an educated person will know. The way that we know that that is true is that we all like to watch, the shows where they go out on the street and interview people with common trivia questions from education, from school. and people are clueless. And we laugh at them because they didn't learn what they were supposed to learn in school or ever, or they didn't remember it, or it wasn't important to them. So if you want to avoid having your child know nothing about the culture that they're living in, you're probably going to want to steer them in some sort of direction and cover a bare minimum of topics. But on top of that, the student can have their interest validated by you saying, yeah, why don't you go ahead and take a month to study this, whatever it is that seems ridiculous to you, but so fascinating to your child. And that to me is what kind of, I'm sure unschooling might be even less formal than that, but I can agree with that kind of unschooling, where the child gets to explore what they're truly interested in without having a ton of extra restraints on their time. Okay, enough of that question. The next question is, who gives the grades, or who determines mastery of a concept? So again, we have a curriculum company, a private school at home, basically, where you've hired somebody to do the work of teaching your child. They turn their work into that person. That person says, yes, he got a B on this test, write that down and move on. In that case, the parent has completely delegated that responsibility to somebody else, which is fine. It costs a lot of money, but it frees the parent up to do something else that they might need to get done. The parent may also grade at home. Some parents are very strict on this, where they use a point system or a rubric. A rubric is just a chart saying you get 3 points for having correct grammar, 5 points for actually answering the question, 2 points for using complete sentences, whatever. The parent has determined what all the points are worth. Or they might have a different point system. Like a lot of times, like a biology text might come with a test and then an answer key. And the answer key tells you how to grade the test. And so that point system is there already in place. And some parents make up their own point systems to give their kids grades. Other parents don't necessarily want to give grades, although you kind of need to when you get to high school. That's a whole different question. But some parents decide that they don't actually have to grade their kids and give them a percentage or an A or anything like that. The parent just informally, in talking to the student or in looking over their shoulder while they do their math, realizes, okay, they don't understand fractions well enough to go on. We're going to have to spend another couple days on this. Or, my goodness, the child spelled all 20 of those words perfectly. We need to have some more challenging lists. So sometimes parents can informally evaluate their student and realize how to adjust the education on their part. That is actually the way that I prefer until we get to high school. The other way people might answer that question is no one needs to give grades or determine mastery, because that is an unnecessary component of education. Again, if you want to release your child to study whatever they want to study, they don't need to be graded because they're succeeding on their own in finding out what they want to learn. Okay, how much parent involvement is another question that could be asked. Does the parent need to be around all the time when the child is learning, or none of the time? So again, if you choose a video company to teach your child at home, you're just going to order their books, turn on the video or the computer, and the student and the other teacher that you've hired take it from there. You have no responsibility except making sure that they are attending to their work. Another possible answer is that parents give suggestions, but there's really no need to micromanage anything. Just, set the kid loose to learn what they want to learn. The other level of parent involvement then would be parents sitting right next to their kids, parents reading books out loud for hours, preparing hands-on experiments, doing art projects, going with them places, things like that. It wasn't necessary for my kids to learn, but that's what I wanted. I'm kind of a bit of a control freak. And so for me, if I was going to have my kids at home with me, I was going to spend as many minutes as possible with them. So while they were young, especially, this was me, the last one right there. I sat beside my kids. We read lots of read alouds. We did activities together. We did art projects together. We cooked together, had all sorts of fun. I think sometimes my kids appreciate that. And I think sometimes they got annoyed by that. A little bit more freedom probably would have been helpful to them, but not going back to do it over again. Okay, another question you can ask about curriculums or approaches is if it aligns with religious beliefs or if it's secular. Many different religions have their own curriculum company that puts out homeschool curriculum in that same alignment with their religion. So that's something to look into. If you have religious beliefs that you would like to pass on to your children, then getting a textbook that comes from that same worldview could be very helpful in moving forward. Some places that offer video curriculum are very religious. Some places that offer video curriculum are not religious at all. And so you have to decide if you are going to be handing that much control over to a company to do school at home. You need to think through what worldview are they being exposed to, and does that align with your family's beliefs, or is that something that you would rather avoid? Oftentimes you can hire a video company that you don't quite agree with, and it just becomes a wonderful conversation point for you when you're talking to your kids about what they've learned. Well, but that increases your parent involvement then. You have to be on top of what the other video curriculum is teaching your kids to be able to have those conversations. So, something to think about. What learning materials are involved? Some companies, it is all workbooks and textbooks, and it looks very much like a traditional education, a traditional school, where everybody's sitting in a desk, everybody's getting out their workbook, everybody's doing this many workbook pages a day to be able to be done by May. So if that's the kind of school you're looking for, then you're going for a more traditional approach. Some people are very into technology, and they will have computers and Kindles and cell phones and DVDs and screens all over the place. And that's not a bad approach either. You're getting a lot of interesting content that's up to the minute and very visual. A lot of kids thrive on that and can take it in very easily. You may be ignoring the discipline of learning to read and take notes, but that's a decision you can make. And you also may be increasing their screen time unnecessarily. That is one of the things that people are concerned about in our era, and we've talked about it already several weeks back, about how much screen time your kids are going to have. And so if you buy a curriculum or take an approach of doing a lot of things online during the day, your kids are already on screens quite a bit during the day necessarily to do their school. And sometimes kids can be sneaky about that, and they can have one tab going for the curriculum that they're supposed to be learning about, and they can have 3 other tabs going where they're doing social media, ordering things off of Amazon, watching YouTube videos, playing a game, and then they can quickly go back to the tab that looks educational when their parent walks into the room. So that's something that you need to think about if you're going to do online schools or videos or technology, is how much temptation can your kids handle when they have a computer open right in front of them and they're supposed to be doing school. Okay, manipulatives, hands-on projects, art supplies, musical instruments. These things are, some families think that they're too much clutter, and so that really annoys them. Some people don't like projects. They would like to have everything neat and clean, tidy, and once the books are put away, that's it. School's done for the day. I was the kind of parent who loved hands-on projects, loved the manipulatives, wanted them to be learning in all different ways, visually, listening, hands-on. So our house was messy all the time, and still is, because I still value this kind of learning where we do an art project once a week. And, we get out the biology microscope lab and we dissect things, and I just like that kind of learning. So you need to think about that approach because it's going to involve more equipment laying around the house. There is an approach here, back with the idea that the whole world is a laboratory, the whole world is our classroom. Everywhere we're going, we're learning something. So if that's the case, then you might not have as much equipment or stuff laying around the house, but you're kind of looking for learning opportunities no matter where you are, inside, outside, on a field trip, at the dentist office, whatever. You're looking for ways that your kid could be learning at that moment, and looking at, one time the kids and I had to go to the chiropractor because I could barely walk. And at the chiropractor, there is a skeleton, hanging in his room. And I'm like, oh my goodness, kids, come look at this. This is a skeleton. And, they were like, 7 and 8. And so I actually have a picture of them holding, a backbone in the chiropractor's office. So I didn't always take them with me to the chiropractor, but when I needed to, we made it an educational field trip. So, How are students divided for instruction? That's another question that you can ask. We're used to the traditional classroom where, you know, everybody who is this old is going to be in this classroom. So that's by age. You could also do it by academic stage. Like all of my early readers are here. All of my advanced readers are here. My high school students are over here. So, you know, if you have a large family, that's something that you're going to be considering. If you don't have a large family, that's not really an important question unless you're part of a co-op and you're trying to see how they group their students. You can also group students by interest. This is done if you have a large family again, or if you're in a co-op where, you know, everybody who wants to learn about bees is over here today, and everybody who wants to learn about the simple machines, pulleys, and gears goes over to this side. So it's not necessarily that they're in a certain grade. It's just what do they want to learn about, and you let them group themselves that way. And then, of course, there's the idea that there's no point to dividing students. Just let all the students go to whatever they're interested in, or however you want to do that. The last question that I have on the list is, when and where do students do homeschool? So a very traditional approach would have everybody in a dedicated schoolroom, you know, like you have an extra office in your home where everybody's in a school desk, and you start at 8 in the morning and you're done by noon, or, you know, maybe even longer, 3. It just feels like school. A more relaxed approach would have you on the couch during the morning for reading read-alouds, and then you could go around the table while you're fixing lunch for them to get their workbooks done. Usually it's during the day, but sometimes if you've had a busy week, they end up doing homeschool in an evening, or sometimes even a Saturday morning instead of Monday through Friday. If you have a very independent group of children, they just find their own space throughout the house, anywhere that's quiet, and they just make their own schedule and get their own work done. And then, of course, you can also have the approach that students are learning no matter what time it is and no matter where they happen to be. So letting, of course, the kids decide what they want to learn, where they want to learn it, and just letting them loose. So all of these are different questions that you can ask when you're talking to somebody and trying to determine what their approach is. Or if you're buying homeschool curriculum and trying to figure out what, if it would fit with your family. And for yourself, as you're navigating these early months of trying to figure out how your family wants to do homeschool, these are questions you can ask yourself. And I would say the only person you need to agree with is your spouse. It's possible that you're part of a larger group that wants to homeschool a certain way, but if that doesn't fit your family, you don't have to be part of that other group. It could be that you're living in a state that has very strict rules about how you homeschool, and in that case, you would need to look at where you're living and if you can live within their rules, or if your family needs to move. I don't say that everybody should move just so they can homeschool their kids the way that they want to, but there are some states that are much easier to homeschool than others. So if you're facing a very restricted way of homeschooling and you wanted to do it a much more relaxed way, you may actually talk about what would it look like for us to move to a more homeschool friendly state. That's a radical approach, I know. Let's go down to the second page. I just wanted to give you some ideas of other places that you could look to read more and do some more research about some of these approaches. The top part is just PDFs that you can click on and learn more and link on. I did want to say something about Rainbow Resource. Rainbow Resource is a homeschool catalog. It's kind of like the Walmart for homeschoolers, where you can just buy just about anything, or the Amazon or whatever. They put out a catalog every year, and on the first couple pages, they actually give you different ways that you can divide up curriculum. So like this one says faith and philosophy, Christian, neutral, or secular. And then they give you a little symbol that goes along with the pages in the catalog later. They can tell you quickly at a glance whether curriculum is Christian, neutral, or secular. This right here, the approach to teaching, is what we've been talking about today. And they list traditional, Charlotte Mason, classical, unit study, Montessori, sequential, spiral, conceptual, and topical. So these are all things that you can learn more about in research. And then as you're looking through their catalog, you can kind of see at a glance which curriculum fits that approach the best. And I also wanted to tell you that in Rainbow Resource, they also have a comparison chart for each academic topic. So if you were looking at language arts curriculum, you have a 2-page spread like this that gives you the name of the curriculum down here, and then tells you all sorts of things about it all the way across, and then even a few extra notes. So that when you're doing your research on curriculum for each subject, you can quickly see at a glance which things are going to align most easily with your family's approach to homeschooling. So that's something you can look up. The PDF is in there already. Also, I wanted to point out that last week when we were talking about Wisdom's Way of Learning, or maybe that was 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, sorry. Wisdom's Way of Learning, she actually spent pages 9 to 25 of her first book outlining 7 non-traditional approaches to homeschool. And she contrasts the traditional ways of homeschool with her lifestyle of learning. So if you didn't have a chance to read that book well the first time around, I would encourage you to understand this part better, to go back and reread pages 9 through 25. She covers learning styles, delayed academics, unschooling, living books and life experiences, unit study, principal approach, and classical approach. Those are her 7 non-traditional approaches. At the bottom of the page, I just gave you a whole bunch of different things that are common words, common approaches, common things that people talk about when they're talking about approaches that you may want to Google and learn better for yourself what each of these things mean. Because when homeschoolers start talking, they're going to start using some of these terms, and you might want to be more familiar with it before you get there. Okay, before we close, I just want to cover a couple other ways. I was thinking about how Jesus taught. When Jesus was on earth, he went around talking and preaching and teaching the people. He had his 12 disciples that he taught, and oftentimes it was a lecture. He would stand up in the synagogue, the temple in Jerusalem, and he would teach the people in the temple. He would teach the people in a synagogue in a different town. He would go out on the hillside, the Mount of Olives, and he would just talk. And a lot of the things that he said, they were parables from nature. So they're stories. I don't remember Jesus actually ever getting out a workbook and a book and saying, turn to page 25, we're going to cover this today. A lot of his lessons were more right in the moment. They were a reaction to something that was asked by somebody. So kind of like a Socratic seminar kind of thing. I do think that Jesus had much of the Bible, the Old Testament, memorized. And I think that would have been common in his culture for him as a young boy to have attended some kind of a rabbi school. I don't know for how many years. I haven't really studied that culture very much, but I'm remembering when he was 12 years old and he was in the temple with the Jewish leaders of that day, he was astounding them with what he had learned, which of course was because he was God and had all understanding as well, but also just the kinds of things that he would have been paying attention to in his own life and his own upbringing would have resonated with the academic people of his day. I do think that he had a lot of the Old Testament memorized, as I said, because when he was on the cross, there are 2 times that he said something, and they were just a few words, but they were referencing the beginning of an entire psalm. And so I think that by Jesus referencing, with one breath, he was getting out the first few words, but it was a way of pointing back to, remember this entire psalm? My God, why have you forsaken me? That would have been an indication to all the people who were standing around that also had memorized the Psalms. He's referring to this one passage of scripture that talks about, it's really about him. There's another saying on the cross, into your hands I commit my spirit. And that is another exact quote from another psalm. So I really believe that Jesus had really formally studied the scriptures at some point earlier in his life, as a child, as a teenager, I'm not really sure. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how your child should learn. I'm just thinking about the different ways that Jesus learned while he was here on earth, and the different ways that Jesus taught while he was here on earth. And I really think it probably could encompass quite a few of the different approaches to homeschool, which is why I don't think we can come down and say, my approach to homeschool is the right one and yours is the wrong one. And I don't think we're supposed to have a judgmental attitude toward other people that we meet. I think if we can remember that every approach of homeschool might work for a family out there, then we're less likely to say well, I've found the right way to homeschool and you haven't, which would be a self-defeating attitude, really. If you want to cooperate with other people and you want to encourage other people and you want to hold other people up in your group and in your community, we need less of this judgmental attitude and arrogance and more of an encouragement and a support that, you know, God has given us so many different ways to teach our kids. Let's embrace as many of them as work in our own families and leave the judging to God. So that's my sermon on that. Next week, nope, not next week, week 19. I wanted to give you this information early enough so that you could find the book and start reading it. It's pretty thick. It's called You Can Teach Your Child Successfully. It's by Ruth Beechick. It's an old classic, and I really enjoyed it. It was encouraging to me when I first read it. So that's week 19, but I will see you here next week. All right. Thanks very much.